Since the year 2000, 12 northern Nigerian states have been operating under a dual legal system, Sharia law running parallel to the Nigerian constitution. That is 25 years, a full generation, long enough to measure outcomes. And the outcomes have been measured. Poverty in the Sharia states is not lower than it was before implementation. Corruption is not lower. Justice is not faster. By nearly every measurable indicator, household income, child mortality, school enrollment, access to clean water, the 12 Sharia states rank at the bottom of Nigeria's 36. Every single one of them. Bottom of the table after 25 years. So here is the question I want you to hold from the very beginning of this video. If Sharia was implemented to serve the northern Muslim poor, if that was the promise and that was the justification, why are the northern Muslim poor worse off today than they were before it was introduced? Who, then, was Sharia actually implemented for? Before we go further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand what is really happening here, you have to go back to the moment it started, and the moment itself is the first clue. The year 2000 was not random. Nigeria had just completed its transition from 16 years of military rule. A new civilian government, a new constitution. For the first time in over a decade, elected governors were sitting in state government houses across the north. Men who had won power through democratic processes, most of them inheriting states that were economically hollowed out, institutionally broken, and sitting on a population with very real, very legitimate grievances. These were governors with a problem. They had made promises, they had no money, no plan, and no track record, and they had an electorate that was watching. Then Zamfara happened. Governor Ahmed Sani Yerima declared full Sharia implementation in Zamfara, criminal code included, not just personal and family law, which had existed in parts of the north for decades, but a complete parallel legal system with public punishments, gender enforcement, and a new corps of religious police. 11 states followed within 2 years. Now, listen to how this has always been told. The official version, the version you will hear from the political class to this day, is that Sharia was a response to the spiritual yearning of the northern Muslim communities, that the people demanded it, that their leaders simply answered, that this was democracy in action, a Muslim majority population exercising its collective will. That's the surface narrative, and it's worth examining carefully because the timing does not support it. These were not governors responding to a petition movement. There was no documented mass mobilization in Zamfara demanding criminal Sharia before Yerima declared it. What there was, and this is documented in the political record, was a governor who needed to establish authority quickly, who had no revenue base beyond federal allocations, who faced a citizenry with genuine frustration about poverty and the failures of the previous system, and who found in Sharia a political language that was simultaneously inaccessible and completely flexible. In political science, there's a term for what happened in 2000. It is called legitimacy substitution. You cannot deliver roads, you deliver righteousness. You cannot account for the budget, so you account for morality. You redirect the question from what have you built to whose side are you on, and you frame it so that asking about the budget becomes an attack on the faith. That was what happened in Zamfara. And when Yerima worked, when the political reward was immediate, when he became a hero, when other northern governors watched his approval ratings and drew the obvious conclusion, 11 states followed within 24 months. But here's what changes the entire frame of this story. The states that implemented Sharia most aggressively never dismantled anything. They added. Sharia courts were layered on top of existing corruption networks, not instead of them. The emirate structures stayed, the patronage pipeline stayed, the land tenure arrangement stayed, the budget opacity stayed. What the Hizbah, the new Sharia enforcement corps, was given power to do was police alcohol, dress code, and gender mixing. What it was explicitly not given was any jurisdiction over procurement fraud, no authority to audit how federal allocations were spent, no mechanism to hold a governor to account for anything that actually affected people's material lives. That boundary between what Sharia enforcement could touch and what it could not touch was never an accident. It was a design feature. Now, let's go deeper into the structure itself, because this is where the political architecture becomes visible. 3 layers of institutional power intersect in this story: the Sharia courts, the emirate system, and the state executive. Understanding how these 3 interact, who appoints whom, who answers to whom, and where the money flows is the only way to understand why this system has persisted for 25 years without delivering what it promised. Start with the constitutional question, because it is one of the most remarkable unresolved legal contradictions in the entire history of Nigerian democracy. Section 10 of the 1999 Constitution is clear. No state shall adopt any religion as a state religion. That is not ambiguous text. It is a direct prohibition. And yet 12 states operate Sharia criminal codes. This contradiction has sat before the Nigerian legal system for 25 years and has never been definitively resolved by the Supreme Court. Not because it is too legally complicated, because no federal government has ever had the political incentive to force the question. Think about what that means. The constitutional ambiguity is not a gap in the law, it is a resource. It allows northern governors to be simultaneously inside the Nigerian constitutional system, drawing federal allocations, participating in NAS, accessing federal appointments, while also claiming a parallel moral authority that sits above federal oversight. You cannot challenge my governance because my governance answers to God. That is an extraordinarily powerful political position, and it is sustained entirely by the federal government's unwillingness to test it in court. Now, look at how the Sharia court system is actually structured, because this is where the political control mechanism becomes explicit. In each of the 12 states, the chief Sharia judicial officer, the Grand Qadi, is a state appointment. The governor appoints him. In most states, the appointment requires confirmation by the State House of Assembly, which the governor's party typically controls. The practical result is that the institution which is supposed to provide independent moral and legal oversight of governance in these states is staffed by the governor's political appointees. Imagine the equivalent in the South. A governor who appoints the Chief Justice of his state's highest court faces no independent confirmation and then claims that court's rulings carry divine authority. The outcry would be immediate. In the Sharia states, this structure has been normalized to the point where it is no longer visible as a political mechanism. It is just how things work. And there is a reason appeals from Sharia court rulings almost never reach the federal court system, despite the constitutional pathway that exists for them. It is not because the rulings are always just. It is because taking a Sharia court ruling to a federal court is socially coded in many of these communities as an act of religious disloyalty. The social cost of appealing creates effective legal immunity for Sharia court decisions, which means the governor's appointee delivers rulings that cannot practically be challenged, which means the governor has, through the Sharia court system, a mechanism of social control that operates entirely without federal accountability. This did not begin in 2000. The structure it plugs into is much older. Northern Nigerian's political elite has operated for generations through an interlocking arrangement of emirati institutions, federal appointments, and, during the military period, military networks. The British indirect rules system, which governed the North during the colonial period, specifically preserved emirati authority because direct administration was expensive. What that system created and what survived independence, survived military rule, and survived democratization was a political-religious fusion in which religious legitimacy was the primary currency of governance. You controlled the emirati hierarchy, you controlled the religious narrative, you controlled the population. What the 2000 Sharia declarations did was not invent this system, they formalized it. They gave it a constitutional footprint and a budget line. They turned what had been an informal arrangement into a state institution. And the specific mechanism connecting the Grand Cadi appointments to the Emirati endorsement structures to the state executive's political interests, we will return to exactly what that means, because it is the thread that runs through the 2027 question in ways that are not yet being discussed in Nigerian media. Let's now be precise about who is winning and who is losing in this arrangement, because the political strategy only makes sense when you map the incentives clearly. The primary beneficiaries of political Sharia are not clerics. This point is important enough to state directly and let it sit for a moment. The religious scholars who populate the Sharia court system, the imams who lend it legitimacy, many of them are sincere men operating within a framework they genuinely believe in. They are not the primary beneficiaries. The primary beneficiaries are politicians who have discovered that religious framing creates a political cost for accountability. A governor who has successfully positioned himself as the defender of Islamic values in his state has made it structurally expensive for anyone to challenge him. A journalist who investigates budget fraud is now implicitly an enemy of Islam. A political opposition who raises governance failures is attacking the faith. A civil society organization that documents human rights violations under Sharia enforcement is a foreign-funded secularist agenda. This is not an accusation. This is a documented pattern of political behavior that repeats with remarkable consistency across every one of the 12 states. Now look at who absorbs the cost of this arrangement. Northern women bear the enforcement burden most directly and most visibly. The restrictions on movement, on dress, on occupational choice, on freedom in public space, these fall almost entirely on women. And Northern women had no seat at the table when these codes were written, no meaningful representation in the state assemblies that passed them, and no institutional avenue for challenging them that does not carry a social cost most women cannot afford to pay. But the structural losers, the people whose long-term position is most damaged, are the Talakwa, the Northern Muslim poor. The farmers, the market traders, the artisans, the young men in the cities with no formal employment, these were the people to whom Sharia was promised as justice, fair prices, honest courts, accountable government, a system where the powerful could not simply buy their way out of consequences. 25 years later, the powerful still buy their way out of consequences. The Talakwa are still waiting. Now, let's map the 2027 calculation, because this is where the strategy becomes most visible. As the electoral cycle begins to shape political behavior, and it has already begun, watch for a specific pattern in the 12 Sharia states. Governors and aspirants with poor delivery records will increase the visibility of Sharia enforcement. Hisbah activity will rise. Religious programming will expand. Public declarations of Islamic solidarity will multiply. Not because there is a new moral crisis, not because crime has increased, because there is an election coming, and the political class knows exactly what this lever does. The pattern is consistent enough across the last 3 electoral cycles that it is now almost predictable. Poor governance delivery is followed within 18 to 12 months of an election by amplified religious and cultural identity politics. The goal is to shift the dominant question in the voter's mind from "What did you build for me?" to "Whose side are you on?" And in a media environment where religious identity is deeply felt and political accountability is abstractly framed, that shift is easier to execute than it should be. Northern voters are not naive about this. Speak to ordinary people in Kano, in Sokoto, in Zamfara. They see it, they name it, often with more precision than the analysts who write about them from Lagos and Abuja. The challenge is not awareness, it is the absence of a credible political vehicle for that awareness. If the only alternative to the political Sharia governor is a figure associated with southern political networks or perceived religious opposition, the identity logic reasserts itself even when the voter knows exactly what is happening. Structural cynicism is still a political outcome. Now look at the regional dynamics, because this story is not uniform across the north. The Hausa Fulani political core, the Middle Belt communities, and the non-Muslim minorities living inside the 12 Sharia states experience this system in fundamentally different ways. For the non-Muslim minorities, in parts of Kaduna, in communities straddling Sharia and non-Sharia zones in states like Niger and Kebbi, political Sharia is not experienced as religious governance, it is experienced as ethnic domination wearing a religious costume. The practical enforcement of social codes that apply formally only to Muslims bleeds across community lines, in markets, in public transport, in shared civic spaces. It is experienced as a hierarchy, not a covenant. And that experience has been driving Middle Belt political realignment for a decade, a steady withdrawal from Northern political solidarity that the Northern political class has largely chosen not to acknowledge publicly. The silence of certain stakeholders in this story is itself data. The Sultan of Sokoto, as the spiritual head of Nigerian Muslims, the single figure with enough moral authority to reframe this conversation publicly, has maintained a calibrated distance from the political Sharia debate for 25 years, not endorsing the abuses explicitly, not condemning them directly, operating in the space between, which is itself a political position. That position reflects the structural dependency of the emirate institution on the political class it nominally oversees. The Sultan's silence is not cowardice, it is the logical behavior of an institution that has calculated correctly that its continued relevance depends on not forcing a confrontation with the governors who sustain its political position.
Follow the money, because this is where the analysis becomes undeniable. The Hisbah agencies, the Sharia enforcement corps operating across the 12 states, receive state budget allocations. In Kano State, at various points in its budget history, the Hisbah board has commanded a larger operational allocation than the state's primary healthcare delivery system. That is not an allegation. That is a documented budget reality available in the state's own published appropriation records. A state government that funds the enforcement of dress codes more generously than it funds the delivery of healthcare is not a government that implemented Sharia for the welfare of its people. It is a government that implemented Sharia for the political convenience of its managers. But here is what almost nobody in this conversation has connected, and it changes the entire picture. The budget allocations to Hisbah agencies have increased consistently in election years. Not in years of rising moral crisis, not in response to documented increases in the behaviors Hisbah is meant to police, in election years. The enforcement corps gets funded when votes are needed. That budget pattern is a political confession written in appropriation figures. Pull back now and look at what this means for Nigeria as a whole, because the Sharia question is not a northern story with northern consequences. The implications run through the entire federal structure. The most fundamental national consequence is what 25 years of federal inaction on the Section 10 question has done to the constitutional order itself. If the federal government will not enforce a clear constitutional prohibition in 12 states because the political cost of doing so is too high, it has established a working principle. Constitutional provisions are negotiable based on political sensitivity. That principle does not stay contained to religion. It seeps into how the Constitution is treated on resource control, on fiscal federalism, on the jurisdiction of federal institutions, on the rule of law itself. Every Nigerian, north, south, east, west, is governed by a constitution whose enforceability has been quietly demonstrated to be conditional. That is a national problem. The economic consequences for ordinary northerners are measurable and largely unreported. The restrictions on women's economic participation, movement controls, occupational limitations, the social costs of Hisbah enforcement on female traders and entrepreneurs represent a direct suppression of labor supply in some of Nigeria's most populous states. A 2021 World Bank analysis of northern Nigeria flagged gender-based economic exclusion as one of the primary structural drivers of the region's persistent poverty gap relative to the national average. The researchers were careful with their language. The data was not. When you suppress half the productive capacity of a regional economy through social enforcement backed by state power, and you do it for 25 years, the compounding effect on household income, on local market activity, on the tax base, and on intergenerational poverty is not a side effect. It is an economic policy. Northern Nigeria is not poor despite Sharia governance. Parts of it are poor in ways that Sharia governance has directly deepened.
Now, the security dimension, and this is where the analysis becomes most consequential. Political Sharia has not reduced religious extremism in the north. In several documented trajectories, it has created the precise social conditions that extremist movements exploit. This requires a careful explanation because it is a claim that is often made carelessly and needs to be made precisely. Boko Haram's original ideological critique, before it became a terrorist organization conducting mass atrocities, was that northern political class Islam was corrupt and hypocritical, that the governors and emirs who claimed to implement divine law were using that law to protect themselves while the poor suffered, that the Sharia courts were instruments of elite control rather than instruments of justice, that authentic Islamic governance had not been implemented, only its costume. That critique was not invented by Muhammad Yusuf. It was drawn from a lived experience that millions of northern Nigerians shared, and it found a ready audience not because those communities had too much religion, but because they watched institutions that claimed religious authority behave with transparent political cynicism. When the official Islamic voice of a state, the Grand Cadi, the Emirate Council, the state-sponsored religious apparatus, is perceived as a governor's political instrument, it destroys the credibility of institutional Islam as a check on radicalism. The communities that turned towards violent extremism were not communities that had rejected Islam. They were communities that had concluded that the official Islam of the political class was a fraud and that authentic faith required rejecting its institutions entirely. Political Sharia did not create Boko Haram, but it hollowed out exactly the institutional religious authority that might have contained it. And now, that Grand Cadi appointment mechanism, a governor who appoints the chief religious judge of his state, who uses that appointment to ensure the official Islamic voice of the state is politically aligned with his interests, who then uses that religious alignment to inoculate himself against accountability. That governor has, through a single structural decision, simultaneously compromised the institution meant to provide moral oversight of governance and destroyed the credibility of official Islam as an independent authority. Both consequences flow from the same appointment, and both consequences persist long after the governor who made the appointment is gone, because the institutional culture he set becomes the expectation for every governor who follows. Step back and look at where Nigeria sits in the global picture, because this is not a unique path. Sudan implemented Sharia under Nimeri in 1983. The result, short-term political consolidation for the elite, accelerating institutional decay, and eventually a security and constitutional crisis that shaped the country's trajectory for decades. Pakistan's various Hudud implementations, northern Mali before 2012, in each case, the structural pattern was identical to what has unfolded in northern Nigeria. Political elites using religious law as a legitimacy substitute, enforcement directed at the powerless, zero accountability for the powerful, long-term governance collapse. Nigeria is not on a unique path.
It is on a documented path. The documentation exists. It is being ignored. The story does not stop at Nigeria's borders, and the international dimensions are less obvious than they appear. Saudi Arabia and several other Gulf states have, over the past 40 decades, financed mosque construction, madrasa development, scholarship programs, and Islamic institution building across northern Nigeria. This is not contested. It is a documented pattern of soft power projection, and it is not inherently sinister. Every major geopolitical actor uses cultural and religious influence as foreign policy. The relevant question is what version of Islam has been promoted through these significant portions of Gulf-funded infrastructure, and how it interacts with the existing religious landscape of the North. The version of Islam being advanced through significant portions of this Gulf-funded infrastructure is architecturally different from the Maliki tradition that has historically defined northern Nigerian Islamic identity. The Sufi orders, the Tijaniya, the Qadiriya, the tradition of Islamic scholarship that shaped Sokoto and Kano and Borno over centuries. The collision between Gulf-funded Salafi influence and traditional northern Nigerian Islamic practice is a live fault line. It produces real theological disputes, real social tensions, and real political stakes. And it is a fault line that sits directly beneath the political Sharia system, because the question of whose Islam is being implemented and according to whose interpretation is not a settled question in northern Nigeria. It is a contested one, and the politicians who use Sharia as a governance tool have little interest in settling it because the unsettlement is more politically useful than any resolution.
The Western dimension is less visible but equally consequential. American, British, and European development programs have collectively spent hundreds of millions of dollars on rule of law, justice sector reform, and governance improvement initiatives in northern Nigeria over the past 2 decades. These programs fund magistrate training, legal aid organizations, court administration improvements, anti-corruption institutions. They operate throughout the 12 Sharia states, and they operate with a remarkable consistency. They engage comprehensively with every aspect of the justice system except the constitutional contradiction at its center. This is not an oversight. Development program designers are sophisticated. They know exactly where the constitutional fault line is. The decision not to engage it is a diplomatic calculation, an implicit bargain. Western donors will not challenge the religious framework if northern state governments allow their development programs to operate and access. The result is a multi-decade, multi-hundred-million-dollar investment in improving the edges of a system whose structural core remains deliberately untouched. The programs produce reports showing progress on specific indicators. The governance crisis deepens. For the diaspora, and there are millions of northern Nigerians in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, the framing of this conversation matters enormously. The analysis being presented here is not an attack on Islam. The distinction between Sharia as a personal and communal spiritual practice, one that has shaped northern Nigerian culture, ethics, and social life in ways that are genuine, deep, and historically significant, and Sharia as a political technology deployed by governors to insulate themselves from accountability, that distinction is one that northern Nigerians themselves are making. Not Southerners, not foreign critics, northern Muslim women, northern Muslim scholars, northern Muslim youth. They are making this distinction loudly and increasingly publicly. The diaspora needs to understand that supporting accountability for the political class in northern Nigeria is not a betrayal of Islamic identity. For many northern Nigerians, it is an expression of it. What I'm about to show you in the next section is where the story becomes truly dangerous, because the strongest arguments for the status quo are not made by cynical politicians. They are made by sincere people, and they deserve a serious answer. Let me make the strongest honest case for Sharia implementation in northern Nigeria, because this analysis is only worth anything if it can withstand the best argument on the other side. The most intellectually serious defense goes like this. The pre-Sharia legal system in northern Nigeria, secular Nigerian law administered through Nigerian courts, was already a catastrophic failure for the poor. Corrupt judges, a court system that operated in a foreign language, processes that took years, costs that the poor could not afford, an environment in which wealth could straightforwardly purchase outcomes. If that is what the alternative to Sharia court looks like, then Sharia courts that operate in Hausa, that deliver judgment within days rather than years, that use a moral framework the community recognizes and respects, those courts are functionally better for the ordinary person. The argument is not that political Sharia is perfect. The argument is that the baseline it replaced was worse. This argument has genuine weight. It should not be dismissed, and it is not being dismissed here. But notice what it actually proves. It proves that Nigerian secular institutions failed the northern poor. That is true and important and demand its own accountability. What it does not prove is that Sharia criminal enforcement, as practiced, as structured, as administered by governor-appointed judges operating in a system with no meaningful external oversight, delivers justice. Those are two separate claims. The first is about the failures of what came before. The second is about the performance of what replaced it. Collapsing them into one argument is the core intellectual sleight of hand in the pro-status quo case. The Sharia accessibility argument is strongest for civil and family matters, where community recognition and cultural legibility genuinely matter, and where the existing formal court system has most comprehensively failed ordinary people. It is weakest, it effectively collapses at criminal law and political accountability. And criminal law and political accountability are exactly where the power of political Sharia is concentrated. The governor is not using Sharia to improve the speed of inheritance dispute resolution. He is using it to make himself untouchable.
Now, the three biggest misconceptions stated directly, corrected without condescension, because these are misconceptions that intelligent people hold. The first and most politically useful misconception is that opposition to political Sharia is opposition to Islam. This is the most important claim for the political class to maintain, and it is demonstrably false. The most consistent and historically significant critics of political Sharia in northern Nigeria are not southern Christians or secular activists. They are northern Muslim scholars, women's rights advocates working within Islamic frameworks, and ordinary northern Muslims who are promised delivery and received enforcement. The late Malam Aminu Kano, one of the defining political figures of northern Nigerian history, spent his career arguing that the northern political elite manipulated Islamic identity to maintain power over the poor. His analysis was made in the 1950s and 1960s, decades before Sharia was formally implemented. The critique is not foreign. It is northern, it is Muslim, and it has a longer history than the system it critiques. The second misconception is that Sharia has failed because it hasn't been properly implemented, that what northern Nigeria needs is more authentic, more rigorous, more genuinely Islamic governance, and then the outcomes will be different. This is the argument that the political class itself most favors because it allows them to simultaneously acknowledge failure and avoid accountability for it. The failure is always attributed to impurity of implementation. The solution is always more power for the implementers. What 25 years of evidence shows is that the implementation was in fact quite faithful to the political intentions of those who designed it. It was designed to consolidate elite authority, to create a governance shield, to redirect accountability. It has done exactly that. The poverty and the injustice are not the failure of the implementation, they are the cost of it, borne by the people who had no voice in its design. The third misconception is that this is fundamentally a North versus South issue, that criticism of Sharia governance is a Southern or Christian agenda imposed on the North. This framing is the political Sharia system's most effective defense mechanism, and it should be named as what it is. Converting an internal northern accountability question into an identity defense against external attack is precisely how the political class avoids scrutiny from within. Political Sharia is not primarily a threat to southern Nigeria. It is a threat to northern Nigeria, specifically to northern women, to northern religious minorities, to northern youth, and to the northern poor. When a northern Muslim woman in Kano says the system has failed her, she is not advancing a southern agenda. She is making a demand that her government answer to her. Framing that demand as external interference is the system protecting itself. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything.
Let's now map what happens next with enough precision that you can watch for the signals yourself. The first and most predictable next move, the escalation of Sharia rhetoric as the 2027 election cycle intensifies. Governors in the 12 states with the worst delivery records, and by the human development data, that is most of them, will increase the visibility of Hizbah enforcement, expand state-funded religious programming, and amplify declarations of Islamic solidarity throughout 2025 and 2026. What specifically for states where the incumbent or the incumbent's preferred successor faces a serious primary challenge? The pattern is consistent. Sharia rhetoric is loudest not when the faith is under threat, but when the governor's political position is under pressure. A spike in Hizbah activity in a state where there is also a competitive primary race is not a religious development, it is a campaign announcement. The second move to watch, a deliberate judicial non-event. There are currently civil society organizations and legal advocates in northern Nigeria operating with significant personal risk, working toward a constitutional challenge of state Sharia criminal codes at the Supreme Court level. Whether that challenge reaches the docket before or after 2027 will tell you something precise about the political calculations being made in Abuja. A federal executive that wanted the constitutional contradiction resolved would not obstruct the process. A federal executive that needs the ambiguity to manage northern political alliances will find procedural ways to delay it. Watch what Abuja does with this question. The action or the inaction is a policy position, whether it is stated as one or not.
The third move is the least predictable and the most consequential, the generational fracture. The northern Nigerian youth population is the largest demographic cohort in the region's history. They are the first generation that has lived their entire adult lives under Sharia and has the data to evaluate it against the promises that were made. They are connected to each other and to the broader Nigerian public discourse in ways their parents were not. They are already producing a conversation about political Islam in the north, on social media, in university spaces, and in informal networks that is fundamentally different from the conversation the political class is managing in official spaces. This is the variable that the northern political class most fears and is least equipped to control. Watch how governors and emirate institutions respond when northern Muslim youth voices publicly distinguish between their faith and the political system that claims to represent it. The response will be revealing. If the system is genuinely confident in its legitimacy, it engages. If it is not, it suppresses. The response pattern will tell you more about the system's durability than any political analyst can tell. What escalation looks like in the near term, increased Hizbah crackdowns that generate media coverage and reinforce religious solidarity framing, coordinated statements from northern governors presenting themselves as a unified bloc, defending Islamic governance against federal or southern pressure, and the framing of any accountability demand from journalists, from civil society, from opposition politicians as an attack on northern identity. What de-escalation would actually require is harder to manufacture and easier to describe. It requires a northern Muslim political voice, someone with enough religious credibility, enough popular legitimacy, and enough political base to publicly and clearly separate Islamic faith from political Sharia. To say, this system has used our faith to protect the powerful and failed the poor, and that is a betrayal of the faith, not an expression of it. That voice has not yet emerged at scale in Nigerian public life, but the conditions for it are building in ways that were not visible 5 years ago. If the current trajectory continues for another 5 years, 12 states, bottom of the development table, governance accountability insulated by religious framing, constitutional contradiction unresolved, the destination is not stability, it is accumulated crisis. The security situation in the northwest and northeast continues to worsen because the governance deficit feeding extremist recruitment continues to be managed rhetorically rather than structurally. The constitutional order continues to erode because the precedent of selective enforcement compounds with each electoral cycle, and at some point, not predictably, but inevitably, a trigger event converts a governance crisis into something the federal system does not have the institutional capacity to absorb quietly. Now, the question that opened this video. If Sharia was implemented to serve the northern Muslim poor, if that was the promise and that was the justification, why are the northern Muslim poor worse off today than they were before it was introduced? The answer, assembled from everything examined here, is this: because it was never implemented for them. It was implemented for a political class that needed a language of authority more durable than democratic performance, a mechanism that converted governance accountability into religious loyalty, a system that could look like justice without delivering it. The northern Muslim poor are not the intended beneficiaries of political Sharia. They are its alibi, the population in whose name the system is defended, whose genuine faith is borrowed for political legitimacy, and whose continued poverty is the price of an arrangement they were never asked to consent to.
The central fact remains unchanged by any framing. 12 states, 25 years, and every human development indicator pointing in the wrong direction, and a political class that has never once been held accountable through the system of divine justice it claims to administer and to embody. Northern Nigerians, and I want to be precise here because this matters, Northern Muslim Nigerians know the difference. They know the difference between Sharia as a spiritual and communal practice that has shaped this region's culture, ethics, and social life for centuries, and Sharia as a political technology deployed by governors to make themselves untouchable. That distinction is not a foreign import. It is not a southern analysis. It lives inside the north, inside Muslim communities, inside the women who have borne the enforcement burden, inside the young men who were promised justice and received theater, inside the scholars who know exactly what the tradition actually demands of those in power. The question is not whether Northern Nigerians can see through the performance. They can. The question, and I want to leave this in the comments, is this: if Northern Nigerian voters already know the difference between political Sharia and real Sharia, what would it actually take to build a political movement that makes that distinction matter at the ballot box? I want to know what you think. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.